into our last session, and this is on DAOs. I didn't know what there was any more of the title, but it's just Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, so on the title. I mean, basically, Eva and Kevin are going to introduce what they're going to talk about, because it's about this book that they're working on. And it more or less says there who they are. I'm sure most people will have heard of or know Eva and Kevin. Eva has been at LSE for quite a long time. And she's been involved in this group, and also actually its kind of predecessor, which is all about intermediate securities, for a long time. It's lovely to have her back, and she's going to introduce her latest research, which is in conjunction with Kevin Werbach, who is at the Wharton Business School in part of the University of Pennsylvania. Kevin has, before that, been in what we euphemistically call practice, but I think he's actually been counsel for the new technology policy in the US Federal Communications Commission, and I think you just work for government or also for private practice. Private practice as well. So there we are, and writes and works very closely with the law department in the area of digital assets. So I will let them present. And then I should say we have our commentator, which is great. Someone who kept very quiet in the last debate, although I thought he had things going on in his head. That is Matthew Kimber, who formerly of the Law Commission and now of something called Matter Labs. Is that right? I got that right?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yes, which is a startup, a tech startup. I know very little about it. I think the website informatively, maybe black. I thought I got the wrong one, but anyway, perhaps I didn't. But anyway, so Matt's going to, there's a lot about all this kind of stuff, and he's going to comment on the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So we are, as you heard, going to present a book project that we are engaged in. We will try and tag team it to make it a little more interesting at the end of the day. The three co-editors of the book are myself, Eva, and Bianca Kremer, who's in the room as well. Bianca is currently a senior fellow at the Blockchain and Digital Asset Project at Wharton, based now in Vienna. This builds on some earlier work that my group at Wharton did on DAOs with the World Economic Forum. We did 2 papers about 2 years ago on legal, regulatory, policy issues for DAOs. Where we are is we have a contract with OEP. We've assembled a group of authors. We have abstracts from everyone. Some of them have submitted drafts of chapters. Those are in the process of coming in. The book will hopefully be out sometime next year. Earlier this week, we had 2 meetings in London at the LSE. On Wednesday, we had a really interesting roundtable with some of the chapter authors who are pretty much all academics for the book, along with a number of DAO operators and practitioners, some of them legal counsel in-house with various DAOs, some of them operational people working in these organizations, talking about what's actually happening in their experience. And then yesterday, we had a hybrid session with all of the chapter authors presenting and talking through, finding common themes and coordinating the project. So that's where we are. What are DAOs? For those who aren't familiar, decentralized autonomous organizations. One way to think about it is, if in the standard law and economics framing, a firm is a nexus of contracts, then a DAO is a nexus of smart contracts. And what that means is essentially that all of the primary rules and relationships of the firm get encoded on blockchain in the form of smart contracts. The assets of the firm are stored in the form of digital assets held in a treasury, typically with what's called a multi-sig shared access wallets. So that requires certain numbers of people under certain conditions to get access to certain resources for various reasons. And typically some component of the governance of the DAO is also done on chain. There are governance tokens issued which don't provide typically equity or a residual claim on the firm, but do provide voting rights to participate in various kinds of token votes for everything from very significant major decisions of the firm to, in some cases, small scale decisions. And there is a range of how decentralized, how much this happens on chain and so forth. But the notion here of DAOs is that unlike traditional firms, they do not have a board and designated management. They don't have the traditional kind of hierarchy of firms. and they don't have the traditional kinds of shareholder equity relationships and debt relationships that usually drive the organization of the firm. This is, I know the words are small, but just to show you, this is a chart from that earlier web paper that my group did, looking at what kinds of things are out in the world from DAOs today. And again, this is about 2 years ago, but there's actually a significant amount of this activity. Probably the biggest category of DAOs in terms of assets are DeFi. Most of the major DeFi platforms like Uniswap and Compound and DYDX and MakerDAO are constituted as DAOs. They have anywhere from several billion to tens of billions of dollars of assets that are controlled in these shared treasuries by the DAO, where decisions like interest rates and other kinds of financial aspects are decided by these on-chain votes. But there also are DAOs, for example, for collective investment. There are DAOs where groups of people get together to go and buy NFTs. They're voting with the tokens on which NFT to buy and which to sell and how to manage them. Sometimes these come together ad hoc. There was one a couple of years ago in the US called Constitution DAO, where several hundred people decided they wanted to bid on an original print of the US Constitution. It was estimated it was going to be about $30 million. That was auctioned at Sotheby's or one of the auction houses. They got together, they raised $40 million and coordinated through the DAO what kind of rights they would get and how they would decide what happened to the Constitution, if it got bought by the DAO and so forth. And were actually able to bid in the auction. They lost. Partly because this is all transparent on chain, so everyone could see how much the DAO had raised. And the eventual purchasers came Griffin as a head knew exactly what he had to bid. Interesting experiment. And then a realistic experiment, I don't get too far, and how you want to did it, how they had to give the money back to people. But yeah, just it shows the kind of variety of things that are happening. Some of these DAOs are philanthropic. There are DAOs that are used to, for example, give grants to open source teams that are working on various blockchain projects where people want to provide money and then provide some oversight and some collective decision making about how that happens. There are DAOs that are used to organize human work. There are DAOs that people can go and do, kind of ad hoc kinds of work projects. Where the DAO coordinates the activity, and a variety of other possibilities just to show the landscape of what's out there. The one at the top left is interesting. There's some debate about whether blockchains themselves are DAOs. So you can think of Bitcoin as a kind of a corporation. It's this machine that has a set of rules that incentivizes people to be miners and creates the value in the token. But it's purely algorithmic. It's not a DAO coordinated human activity in the same way. So you can put that as a kind of a category, but some people would say that's not really a DAO. Why is this interesting? Well, the argument, as with lots of other things with blockchain and digital assets, is putting everything on chain. You get the certainty, you get the flexibility, you get the efficiency, and you can eliminate many of the kinds of problems that we have in traditional human organizations. On the other hand, as you all know, we see with other kinds of blockchain and digital asset phenomenon, in the real world, we see hacks, we see disputes, we see other kinds of failures that happen, and we see things that get implemented that are not necessarily purely decentralized to the ideal that we hear described. But the reality is this is a significant phenomenon in the world. And we in this project are not necessarily taking a position about our view about how important DAOs are. Are DAOs going to replace, to any significant extent, traditional corporations? We simply think this is something that is sufficiently significant to be interesting. And even if it does not go forward in the same way, pushes us to ask a whole set of questions that are relevant for corporate law as well. So the exercise is basically to bring together experts in corporate law and corporate governance to try to understand what that community can learn from DAOs. And then hopefully as well, understand what the existing kinds of legal areas and people with that expertise can help us to understand and help the DAO community go forward as well. All right, so with that, we'll turn it over to you. Let's get started.
I'm going to talk us through the contributors and what they're each going to write about. And then we'll move on to me saying a little bit about what my chapter is about, and then back to Kevin, who will speak about his chapter. So what we're going to do, or what we can see here is the plan for the book. So we're going to start with the first block DAOs as innovations in the corporate form. And one aspect is sort of first chapter, Michael Schillings, he is going to speak about how DAOs fit with the history of corporate law. And his point of comparison is that corporate law, of course, started as projects being developed, funding being sourced for projects that needed funding. We didn't have funding mechanisms, so inventions were made to generate that resource. And he draws a comparison there. So the DAO and the corporation is a technology that serves certain projects. So there's a comparison there. And then something that came out of the workshop we had 2 days ago, DAOs started out as being, or the idea for them, the conceptual idea was it's entirely computer-based. That's no longer the case. So there's a lot of legal corporate law in DAOs. So associations are used, foundations are used to structure DAOs, to structure sub-DAOs. So there's a lot to know about what kind of legal mechanisms are there. The jurisdictions are Switzerland, Gibraltar, the Channel Islands, Cayman, and some American jurisdictions. So there's a sort of survey paper on the legal forms. And then there's a Sean Bayer's paper about are bespoke DAO forms needed. So there are bespoke DAO forms. Wyoming, for example, has a statute. What we heard yesterday was it's quickly drafted, somewhat poorly drafted, maybe a little bit like MICAR, in response to market participant wanting something, a state in the United States seeing some industry that they might attract. So Wyoming also is quite interested in becoming the next Silicon Valley. And then it maybe doesn't cost very much. You put a statute there and hopefully you attract some investors. And the questions, are they needed? He wasn't optimistic about whether they're needed. With the whole day-to-day also, are we reinventing the wheel? Is there something new here? And my take on this is there's never anything new. It's always a question of there's certain concepts, there's fungibility, there's transferability, and we implement these concepts in a certain environment and through certain technology. And in some ways, there's nothing new. In other ways, there's a lot to know about what is this environment. And then Anat and Nitzan are talking about investment schemes. So they look at the rules on investment, collective investment schemes and how those sit with DAOs. Then my chapter, I'll speak about that later. Jill Fish talks about corporate governance and how the corporate governance debate and how that links up onto DAOs. And her point, her observation yesterday was DAOs ask exactly the same questions. And the DAO debate should be informed by the corporate governance debate, but also there are ideas from DAOs that the corporate governance debate would benefit from. So for example, voting mechanisms. Would it be a good idea to make voting easier, the operational exercise of voting rights? So there's and she's going to work out how these two spaces interact with each other. A really interesting paper by Primavera and Morshed on fiduciary duties in this space. And that's particularly interesting because there's this tension between decentralization and hierarchy. And of course, the design of a DAO is to be as decentralized as possible, yet hierarchy is still necessary. You still need somebody to start the DAO. You need a creator. You need somebody who writes the code. And there's questions, do they owe fiduciary duty? In which circumstances do they? What can you do if they don't want fiduciary duties, such that they don't have them? And then there is a paper by Jason, Aaron, and Chris, and they are talking about institutional cryptoeconomics. So they are interested in the ledger and how does a distributed ledger affect the economics of this way of collaborating? Is there something special in organizing collaboration through a distributed ledger? Okay. Yeah, then there's Bianca's chapter. So Bianca is her field is arbitration, and she will look at two things. She will look at there are arbitration programs. So at the very basic level, a DAO is a computer program, and there's ways of resolving disputes through arbitration dispute. So DAO dispute resolution mechanisms, and also how dispute resolution mechanisms that we have already apply to DAOs. So some of it, of course, we were also discussing here. Then we talk about, so Florence is writing on the private international law aspects. And there is, of course, a little bit of overlap with digital assets because there are tokens and those need to be resolved. But there's also a question of, is there a focus point for this? Is this an organization? Is this a way of collaborating? Is it an association? Where is it located? Then, of course, Duncan earlier said it never happens. DAOs, of course, become financially distressed. Sometimes they become financially distressed because they're sued. And then what has happened in the US is that they start bankruptcy proceedings. So they seek the shield of the favorable Chapter 11 rules, where they sort of try and work out ways of enforcing or not of resolving their situation. Then Iris Chu is going to talk about MiCAR and how that applies, and crypto asset service providers and how that relates to DAO. Kelvin and Edmund characteristically ask the question, what are they for? And sort of they say they're actually pointless because everything the DAO does, the corporation does, we don't need DAOs. I think it's really useful to have them in the room. And then Jason and Peter are going to talk about also organization, and their focus is what is automatable, what should be automated, how do smart contracts come in? The original idea was that everything can be done on a smart contract. That's no longer the practice. So some things are automated, others are not automated. And then Kevin is going to speak very shortly about the connection between AI and DAOs. All right, so then what am I going to do? I'm going to do a corporate law theory analysis of the DAOs. You've seen earlier that this is an enormous space. So you have on the one hand something that looks a bit like a cult. So a situation where people that strongly believe in certain communitarian, libertarian idea build a new way of living through a chain, that can be a DAO. You have something that looks a bit like a cooperative. So working together, creating open source code for the common good of the users of that code. And then you have something that looks indeed maybe like a firm where people are trying to create surplus that is then will then be given to contributors in some form or another. So that's a very, very big church. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look the idea of the theory of the, hang on, there we go. So the theory of the firm is this idea that when we exchange things, we do this through a market. And then sometimes a way of working together or bringing resources from one person who maybe doesn't want the resource as much as the person who then buys the resource or uses the resource, that is so complex an activity that we want to carry out that we create a hierarchy. And this is Coase's theory that, so Coase's, Ronald Coase, as then discovered by Oliver Williamson, has the theory that firms begin because there is economic activity that is so complex that the cost of transacting is so high that this activity is organized through a hierarchy. And then I've written a book that says this perspective of firms and hierarchies as the two things through which an economic activity is organized misses out that firms are more than a focus point for contracting. And I say that we need to learn from management about what organizations do. And I put forward a framework that says we need to distinguish constitutional action from policy action from operational action. And that's an analytical framework that uses Eleanor Ostrom, who was a sociologist. She and Oliver Williamson were awarded a Nobel Prize on their work. So I'm going to, together with my co-author, analyze through case studies the DAO landscape, and then develop a sort of a theoretical explanation of what is going on. So how are they constituting themselves? What are the ways in which they establish themselves? Are they creators? What do their constitutions look like? How do they set out who decides what? What are the participants? What kind of decisions do they take? How do they take decisions? So that's going to be the contribution that I'm going to make together with my co-author. And then over to him.
All right, and then last bit, my chapter here is at the very end of the book, so it's deliberately somewhat speculative and also trying to thread together this work that I do on DAOs and blockchain and digital assets with the other thing I spend a lot of my time thinking about now, which is AI policy and governance. And so part of this is descriptive. What are the connection points between DAOs and AI? One is DAOs being a governance mechanism for AI. There are already a number of initial efforts, for example, to put AI models on the blockchain for tamper-resistant tracking of either data provenance or model development. Then beyond that, to tokenize the data assets or the compute to decentralize those resources, which right now are leading to massive concentrations of power around the major AI models. And other sorts of earlier stage experiments around building DAOs around some of these AI assets. The flip side of that is how might AI be a governance mechanism for DAOs? Again, DAOs are driven by token voting, and so you can imagine AI systems being used to inform and automate and make more efficient some of those decisions by users around DAO activities. And again, there's some interesting early experiments going on. One of them I mentioned there is Near, which is one of the major layer one blockchain platforms. The founder of Near is a guy named Ilya Palushkin, who was one of the authors of the Transformer paper at Google, which is the foundational technical paper for the current rise of generative AI. So, they have people that are well suited to bring that together. And then the third possibility is, well, what if one imagines what Vitalik Buterin, the creator of Ethereum, and also the person who first articulated in 2013 this concept we now call DAO, he called the dream of science fiction. What if one imagines the DAO is a kind of artificial AI-generated, AI-managed agent? And we're seeing a lot of development now in the generative AI world of agentic systems. So instead of just saying, ChatGPT, give me a haiku about private law of digital assets, we say, ChatGPT, write a book about this topic. And it's able to go out and not just assemble the table of contents, but actually recruit the contributors, actually compensate the contributors, actually negotiate the contract with the press, actually manage the process. There's no fundamental technical reason why AI systems can't either do that reasonably well or in the world through other kinds of systems to do that. And putting that together with DAOs gives that AI agent much more agency in the world because it's able to control assets directly and interface with real world systems through the DAO. So this is not something that exists today, but if we go forward and think about where these things might converge, that's where it leads. Really, the tipping point here is the degree of autonomy. Autonomy is the A in the DAO acronym, but no doubt they are really autonomous. They're almost entirely human controlled without a great deal of independence. But it is possible to look forward as these systems become more autonomous that overlap with a lot of discussions that are going on in the AI world about alignment of AI systems and how they potentially become more autonomous. And so ultimately, I think that this analysis sheds light on some of the key problems that are in the discussion in AI governance. Things like, is the entity responsible? Is the AI system legally responsible? Are the people behind it? What if we've got a foundation model like a GPT or Google Gemini, which is designed for general purposes, and then someone else customizes and implements it in a certain way? Big challenge in the AI context gets to some of these similar kinds of questions about autonomy and control that we see in the DAO context. What about autonomous systems causing harm? For example, autonomous weapons. Potentially great military and strategic benefit, but also great concern if you put an AI system controlling a drone. What if it doesn't work and shoots the wrong person? What if it does work and it's a really incredibly powerful autonomous global killing machine? These again are questions that are being debated in the literature that we might think of how we can get some traction on how to address them by looking at DAOs. And finally, humans in the loop is a very common element of proposals for AI governance, which tends to be done in a very simplistic way. Let's put it, say there's a human that has to check this to make sure the system isn't biased. What is that human doing? What do they have? What understanding do they have? There's been a recognition now that those human in the loop requirements, while the notion makes some sense, we need to ensure that humans actually can do better than the AI and are serving some useful purpose. Again, similar set of questions that we're seeing in the DAO context. So ultimately, I think our hope here, and our sense definitely from the conversations we had yesterday, is whichever answer we get on these different questions, not just in this chapter but broadly, is useful. If in fact it's the case, surely it will be in a lot of areas, that even though the technology is crazy and wild and new and totally different, that the issues are exactly the same for long governance. That's interesting, because that tells us something about what's enduring and what's really fundamental about some of those legal concepts and theoretical constructs. To the extent that it's not, to the extent we find patterns of behavior and patterns of action and what makes more sense in terms of the role of law and the role of non-legal kinds of constraints on behavior, to the extent that that's different than what we find in the traditional physical world, that's interesting as well. So that's our hope with the project, and we'll stop there and love to hear Matthew's response.
Thank you.